here at East Hill. See Brother Joe every Friday, almost every Friday night at Friday night singings when we're going to get cranked up here before very long. And he's a great song leader, and he and I sing bass, and we try not to sit together. He sits over yonder, and I sit over there, and we just join in on the bass part. And it's nice to be here this morning with Steve and Tammy also. Steve didn't want me to tell you that Tammy's my niece, but I did anyway, didn't I? And so it's nice to be with them this morning here at East Hill. I'm glad that I've been invited to present this presentation this morning at the Bible School Hour about the Voice of Truth radio program, or I call it also worldwide radio evangelism. And it blows my mind. It just, I can't get it out of my mind. Almost every day, all day long, I'm thinking of ways of trying to communicate to somebody who has never heard the gospel. That's an unusual experience. If I'm preaching to you every Sunday, I'm thinking about you and what you may need to hear. When I'm thinking about the world, what is it that the world needs to hear? Very basic stuff. Very basic stuff. And it's interesting what we can do and what we can say to interest people in the gospel of Jesus Christ and the churches of Christ. Now, if we have time here, we're going to go to Romans chapter 16. So if you have a Bible, you might lay it open somewhere there. Like I say, now he told me that at 9:15 is about the cutoff time. He reminded me that there would be a bell. Well, I don't hear bells. They have to buzz me 2 and 3 and 4 times at Gandy, before I finally hear it. So anyway, maybe I'll look at the clock and not run over too bad. But go into all the world, preach the gospel to every creature. He that believes and is baptized shall be saved. One frustrating thing about this ministry is that I don't know who is being saved. But I do know that they are hearing what they need to hear to be saved when they are listening to the broadcast, or also if they are coming to the website. This is a combination. Now, the two didn't begin together. I started preaching on the radio before I actually set up a website and began to construct the website to go along with the preaching. And so at first, I wasn't advertising the website on the radio program. But as time went on and we began to have the website, we began to advertise the website, and I'll talk more about that as we go along. These are the places from which I preach now. Did I mess something up? There we go. I probably pushed the wrong button on this thing. But in 2010, it was December 2010 that I began preaching from Sri Lanka, the island off the coast, the island nation off the coast of southern India. Brother J.C. Choate, perhaps you have heard of him. He's very famous for his world evangelism from Winona, Mississippi. His publishing company has published worlds of literature scattered about the world. And then, of course, occasionally you see this little Reader's Digest, really smooth, glossy-like thing, Reader's Digest version of the Voice of Truth International. Perhaps you have seen it. But J.C. Choate began this radio program, this English broadcast from Sri Lanka, and was the on-the-air speaker for 30 years. And he passed away about 2008, I believe it was. And then for 2 years, his tapes were heard from that broadcast. One of the unique things that Brother Choate would do, he would go to Sri Lanka or to India in order to do this preaching, to do this recording of his program. And he would go and he'd stay as long as the visa from India would allow him to stay, which was normally only about 60 days to 90 days. And so he would, during that period of time, he would then record these programs that was to be broadcast through the year from Sri Lanka. And then this 15-minute broadcast, by the way. And then also he would gather around him other preachers. He'd have his manuscripts, and he would give them to the language-speaking preachers that he was associated with, and they then also would preach these sermons by radio. And some of those characters are still preaching in their language from radio. Of course, as time went on, over the period of time, they began to do their own sermons. They didn't need Brother Choate to prepare or to write their sermons for them. But this is the way this work began about 1976 or 1978. This work began with J.C. Choate. Well, in 2008, when he passed away, they continued his sermons on tape. But then Brother Wayne Barrier, who had become associated with J.C. along the way, about 1986, then he kind of took over this work of visiting these preachers and also handling these funds that went for the mission work. And this radio program also fell to him. He asked me to participate in it. From Florence, Alabama, I had for about 10 years had a 5-minute daily radio program. Called it 5 Minutes with the Bible, or A Few Moments with the Bible. Started in Brinkley, Arkansas in 1976 doing this. 5 minutes a day, every day, and a few moments with the Bible. And so he knew about that program, and so he asked me to consider doing this 15-minute program from Sri Lanka. And so in December 2010 is when my voice was heard as the voice of truth in Sri Lanka. I actually changed the title of it a little bit. I said the voice of truth with Larry Murdock, because I thought the voice of truth is Jesus Christ. And if I can echo that truth, then I am doing what the Lord wants me to do. And so that's what we attempt to do. The first time that I preached from Moscow, Russia, I got an email from a Russian, and he says, "What makes you the voice of truth?" I said, "I'm not the voice of truth." I answered him back. I said, "Jesus Christ is the voice of truth. If I can echo him, then I am succeeding in what the Lord wants me to do." I heard no more from that objector. That seemed to satisfy him. But then later on, about 2011, several churches of Christ in Lawrence County began to pool their money at the Pulaski Street Church. And through, again, Brother Wayne Barrier and his contacts, we began broadcasting from Taiwan to Southeast Asia, to the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, etc. And so I began to give a Filipino's contact information, put his telephone number on the air, and the Filipino preacher, well known in the Philippines, receives any telephone calls that program produces. From Sri Lanka, the local missionaries, a telephone number is given. I started out giving simply their address of the church building there, but then they requested that I give the telephone number, so I put his telephone number on it, and then they began receiving 2 to 3 calls every week after this program would air on Wednesdays. Okay, so in 2011, we went on the air from Taiwan, and then along about that time, 2012, is when I began to develop this website. And then in about 2014, we started preaching from Moscow, Russia. I started casting about for other places from which to preach, and I found that this station in Moscow, in fact, I sent out a lot of letters to a lot of radio stations in the world and only got one back. The Russian president of this radio station in Moscow, Russia, says, "Hey, we program in English every Thursday. I said, hey, do you have any time? He said, I've got a 7 p.m. slot, 15-minute slot. I told the elders at Gandy about it. They said, go for it. I said, call the president back, email, and we nailed down that program. And we've been paying that program and broadcasting that program, the Gandy Church has, now for these years since. When I did that, you see, a little earlier than that, I already had the website, and I was advertising the website. Now, I had contacted some of my former Russian students. For 13 years, I taught in a Bible school in Russia, 13 different years, and so I had some contacts. And so I asked some of them, one in Moscow, one in a place not far from Moscow. I said, would you like to receive information or contacts that anyone might call you if that be the case? Well, they volunteered to do that. But then I get to thinking about that. The president of this radio station told me that they are not in good with the government, that the government was hounding them. The government says that you have too much American religion on the air. Well, he's programming in English one day a week, and most of that programming is coming from America. Mine comes on at 7 p.m. right behind Jack Van Impe. Any of you know Jack? Jack Van Impe? You see him on TV some? Yeah? Well, he comes on right before I do. I come on right behind him. He talks about world events, and I come on and talk about gospel events, teach the truth of the gospel. But anyway, when I did that, my European visitors to my website just lit up. You see, that Moscow station not only is broadcasting locally, Moscow and local suburbs of in Russia, but they are heard all over Europe via internet. They stream their internet, on the internet, the programming. And so I began to see people coming to the website from all over Europe, all the European countries. From Taiwan, they also stream on the internet. And that makes, you see, the gospel message available not only on air, whoever can hear this radio program, but also on the internet to anyone who might be listening in. So that was in 2014, and this has been a very productive thing. People from all over Europe have come to my website. And then in 2016, I was shopping around again for a place, an outlet, and found one in Okeechobee, Florida. They have a tower in Okeechobee, and they broadcast to Africa, West Africa, and they call themselves Radio Africa. Well, I presented that to the elders at Gandy, and they said, go for it. And so we did. And we put that on the air, and now since 2016, we've been on the air in West Africa. Now, the West African nations that speak English or have official English language, that's the official language, is Nigeria and also Ghana. And those are the people I hear from. They send letters to the radio station, Radio Africa, and then every once in a while, every few weeks, they will send me a batch of letters from these people. In the meantime, through Brother Jerry Bates with World Evangelism, one of the associates of Wayne Barrier, I've got me two contacts, one in Nigeria and also in Ghana. And so I have sent them, when I get a letter from people and I recognize it's a new address, a new person, I send those to these contacts. If it's in Nigeria, I send it to that brother, and in Ghana, I send it to another brother. And so we don't know exactly what is the end result of all that, but I do know I got a letter from a Muslim man in Nigeria, and he said that he had heard one of my programs. In fact, I had started that program in September of 2016, and in October, this Muslim heard a particular program. He told me in the letter what he had heard that convinced him that he needed to be a Christian. He had already had some influence from he called a Christian friend. and who had encouraged him. And so I investigated, and I found out which program he heard, because he had talked enough about what he heard that I identified the program, and it was in late October that he heard that broadcast. In December is when I received his letter, and he said that he had since become a Christian. I don't exactly know what he meant by that, but I found out that he needed to learn some more, because he says, and my 4 wives are also convinced. So this Muslim with the 4 wives still needs some training, doesn't he? Still needs some teaching from the gospel of Christ. But very interesting to know that people hear, and it's very interesting to receive these letters from Nigeria and Ghana, because they talk about, and I get them from pastors, I get them from denominational leaders, and so if they take the gospel back to the people they're teaching, what kind of result might that be? Only God will probably know. One of these days, when I'm with God, maybe I too will know. But that's from West Africa. Now, just last year, in 2018, we finally got enough money together. Pulaski Street and also the New Lycea Church in Murray County pooled their money and put the gospel on the air on some FM stations in Liberia, which is right out on the coast, you see, of West Africa. Liberia, I found out from a LinkedIn person. He was a radio preacher, so he and I got to talking online, and come to find out he's a Liberian gospel preacher. He was trained in Nigeria at a school, a Bible school in Jos, who was founded by a missionary I know very well. And so we got to talking, and he is a radio preacher. He has a 30-minute program. And so I said, hey, that's great. That's wonderful. And I told him about mine. I gave him, in fact, I sent him a sample of one of my radio programs. He said, I want this here too. Can we get it here? And so I presented it to Pulaski Street and also to New Lycea, and they said, hey, we'll do that for a year. And so they gave me enough money to start in July. In fact, the last Saturday, it comes on Saturday, the last Saturday in June was the first time that my voice was heard in Liberia. Since then, in the last 6 months, just 3 weeks ago, Jonathan Cooper, no relation, I'm sure, but Jonathan Cooper sent me a note and an update on what had been happening to the program. He said since July, when it came on, the 6 months, my program coming on every week since July, he said 98 people have called me. He gave his telephone number, you see. In fact, he did the tags. He did the first tag, which says, you are listening to The Voice of Truth with Larry Murdock, brought to you by Churches of Christ from around the world. And then the last tag, you have been listening to The Voice of Truth with Larry Murdock, brought to you by Churches of Christ from around the world. And then his telephone number, then any address he would like to give, and then any encouragement that he might say. And so he did that in his own voice. By the time I got through with it, it sounded like $1 million, although I could hardly understand it. And I stuck those on each of the programs that I send him, and I send them 3 months at a time to him. And so his voice comes on, you see, on my program, and his voice is at the end, and his telephone number, and he receives these calls. He says, in 6 months, I've received 98 calls. I've had 14 Bible studies with people. 11 people listeners have come to services where I have preached, and he says 5 have been baptized. And then he gave me a sample. He gave me a sample of some of the calls. He said, they might say this or they might say that. And then I was really intrigued by the one that said, hello, I am just very happy that you translate that white man. Did you get that? I didn't know that he could knew I was a white man. But anyway, he says, I am happy that you translate that white man. Well, if you heard his lingo, heard his tags, you would understand that what he means by translation. But come to find out then, his 30-minute program comes right after mine. He started me with 15, and then he went for another 30 minutes, so that's 45 minutes of the gospel being taught. Furthermore, I found out why he wanted my manuscripts. He said, send me your manuscripts along with the audio. And so I've been doing that, and come to find out, he's been translating me. He's been basically preaching my sermon the next 15 minutes, and then the last 15 minutes, he takes phone calls. So that really blew my mind that all this was happening, and that's when he receives the phone calls. Well, we purchased 4 FM radio station time slots, but then come to find out there's a Brotherhood FM station that's in Monrovia, the capital, and they agreed to put it on free. And so on 5 FM radio stations, and if I have time, I'll get to a little more than that. Well, just 2 weeks ago, January the 6th, the first Sunday in January, and the first Sunday of the year, I started preaching from Central and South America. This came about with a grant from a wealthy person's trust fund that is overseen in Lawrenceburg by one of our Christian women, sisters in Christ. And so me and the Pulaski Street elders sent letters to her saying, we'd like you to consider this. We want to preach to Central and South America on Sundays. They had a slot open, and I told them that's what I'd like to do. And so they provided the money for a year's worth of programming, which started the first Sunday in January. But then the first Saturday in January, also I began preaching from the Sudan, southern Sudan, and an FM station, one FM station, which also is heard in northern Uganda. And I know there are churches of Christ in that region. And so I don't have any contacts yet, like I do in Liberia, a telephone number they can call. But I know that churches of Christ could benefit. It's kind of like aerial bombardment. You fly over the thing and you loosen up the resistance. And you bomb the area weekly with these gospel messages. And you loosen up the resistance to the gospel. And then almost always at the end of my program, I say, visit a Church of Christ near you where you can learn more about today's topic, whatever that was. And so these are the places in the world that I am preaching. Some of this Liberia, I want to quickly go through this. 155 Churches of Christ in Liberia's 15 counties. Now, Liberia is about the size of the state of Tennessee, as I'll show you in a minute. These are approximate locations of the 5 FM stations. You can see down at the bottom all of this blank area, very rural areas, and those FM stations don't reach that far. My friend Jonathan Cooper, the radio preacher in Liberia, he's got a vision. His aunt lives more toward the south down there. She has some property. He wants to put a tower on that property. He wants to have an FM station broadcasting from that tower that reaches the rest of the country of Liberia. And I hope that he can do that. His sponsor, by the way, is a church in Oklahoma. And so I've been in touch with them, and we're talking about that now. This is the state of Tennessee, and that red line kind of outlines the size of Liberia. Whereas Tennessee has 95 counties, Liberia only has 15. You can imagine how large they are. Approximately 350 miles across the southern border of Tennessee, about 150 miles wide, and this is about the way it is in Liberia. 350 miles of coastline, and at its furthest point, about 150 miles. And so you can see there's still some work to do, radio work that could be done still further south in the country. And notice the numbers. You see the 0, the 0, the 0, the 2, the 1, and the 6 up there. Those are the churches of Christ that are in those counties. And so if we can reach, kind of bombard those areas, perhaps the gospel can finally and ultimately go to those areas in the country of Liberia. Let me tell you a little about the gospel content that we have. The attention step. I always start with an attention step. Perhaps it's a question or something, and then comes the tag in a professional voice. It's usually Gary, my brother's voice, where he says, you are listening. In a quiet voice, he says, you're listening to the Voice of Truth with Larry Murdock, brought to you by Churches of Christ from around the world. And then at the end, it's his voice again, which gives the closing tag, which you have been listening to the Voice of Truth with Larry Murdock, brought to you by Churches of Christ from around the world. You may be interested in coming to our website. And also, he will give the any personal contact number for, that we know about that we can use in the program. The need step is why do you need this lesson? Why do you need to know the answer to this question I've just asked, etc. And so then the satisfaction step. This is why you need to know this, and this is how it looks on you. This is what it means to you. That's the visualization step. And then finally the action step, which includes the tag. And almost all of my sermons in this way: visit a Church of Christ near you where you can learn more about this, where you can obey the gospel of Jesus Christ, if I've been talking about the plan of salvation, for instance. And so this is the way that it's set up. This is the content. But then the website content. Thevoiceoftruth.us is where you'll find us. Thevoiceoftruth.us, not .com. That's a Pentecostal group, I believe. But voiceoftruth.us is what we use. And you'll find this button, Bible Study, that takes you to Austin, Texas, the World Bible School. If they want to enroll online, if they have that ability to enroll online, they can do that. I find out that most people do not. Furthermore, on the website, they can find my contact information. They can send me emails, but no one ever does. That's strange to me. It seems like they would want to talk to me, but they don't. Not as long as they have 86 sermons they can choose from. On the website, they can choose from 86 sermon titles, and they are very interested in those. And so these are in PDF forms. These sermons are in manuscript form, the complete manuscript. If they heard that on the radio, they can also see it in print. And these things are downloaded right and left all over the world. Audios are MP3 files. They are audio files. You click on them and you immediately hear my voice in that particular sermon title. Well, these are some of the things that they might find there. Out of the 86, I redid this list a little bit, and you can see it in, notice it's different blue, but I couldn't find that, locate that blue that's at the bottom. But you see, I'm not highly technical, you guys in the back. I'm not a highly technical person, so anyway, this is what you see. But that inspiration and the Bible, in 2018, that was the most downloaded sermon of the 86. People wanted to know about the inspiration and the Bible. And only 10 hits back of that was this sermon, Finding God. Finding God. Are you searching for God? How do you find God? And then, right behind that, calling on the name of the Lord. People are interested in calling on the name of the Lord and what that means. Restoring first century Christianity comes right in behind it. The Godhead, the Trinity. Marriage is about a bed. That's a sermon on homosexuality. And will we know one another in heaven? Is the church necessary? Is it hard for you to believe? If the Church of Christ should close, this one was born of a denominational preacher who was coming on behind me in Lawrenceburg. He decided that he wanted to take on the Church of Christ. And every Sunday, same thing, Church of Christ. The Church of Christ should close, he says. The Church of Christ should close. So I developed 2 sermons and rolled them into one here. If the Church of Christ should close, what would happen? Interesting sermon. You can find it at the website. Inspiration of the Bible. That's a little bit different than inspiration and the Bible. This is more of an evidence thing. Hey, the Bible is inspired. Here are the reasons. The other thing is, what about inspiration? What that's like? Is it just meditation? How was the Bible inspired, etc.? And so that's that first program. Introduction to the New Testament, Introduction to the Old Testament, Introduction to Bible Study. Why believe the Bible? Why should you live by the Bible? You will be raised from the dead. You will see Jesus coming again. What is hell like? Visitors to the website, this is in 2 years. That first column there is in 17. The second column in just the year ended, 18. And you notice in 17, 55 countries were represented at the website. In this past year, 42 countries were represented at the website. Just this month, for instance, China, number 1 behind the U.S. The U.S. is always number 1 because you see more computers. We're more computer literate than anyone else in the world, I suppose. But at least we have more of them. We'll put it that way. But China was next. Ukraine, Sweden, Russia, Germany, South Korea, France, Belgium, Japan, British Virgin Islands in the Caribbean. And that happened the week after my program started broadcasting to the Caribbean and South America. Hong Kong, the gateway to China. Canada, Spain. I haven't had one from Spain in quite a while, so Spain lit up this time. And then Great Britain, in England, or Great Britain, Scotland, those countries, Ireland, Northern Ireland, they come to the website. Well, look at, that's in 2017, 55 nations, that's some of them there listed. And then this is some of the activity. Now, since May of 2017, there were actually 1,742 who visited the website. 600 of those people more than once. I call them the congregation. I call them the congregation. And by the way, so far in this month of January, I've had 896 visits to the website. Only 216 of them are new. Everybody else had been there before. That makes everybody else has been there at least 4 times. At least 4 times. And so they not only get what they come for the first time, but they are also picking up other sermons as well. Since May of 2017, and it's since May because that's when I finally figured out the technical part of it to get these stats, okay? So see, I'm not a really high-tech person. I'm kind of a low-tech person. But 3,086 sermons were downloaded since May of 17. But then in 2018, look at that, 10,000, almost 11,000 hits, 4,300 pages viewed, 3,515 visitors, 1,679 were there more than once. This is the congregation. 1,679 persons have been there more than once. And 6,276 sermons have been downloaded. 6,276 sermons. How long would it take a gospel preacher to preach that many sermons? And finely crafted, tuned sermons to the person who has never heard it before. And that is an amazing statistic. And it's very encouraging. Yes, indeed, radio is a missionary. That's a whole lot of preaching. We're overseen by the elders of the Pulaski Street Church of Christ. The reason that it's not Gandhi, Joe, is because Gandhi didn't have elders when I started this. But since then, about 3 years into our work at Gandhi, elders were appointed, and we have 2 fine elders. And so they have taken up the mantle, and these are the people at Gandhi who support that Radio Africa broadcast. These are the people who support that program from Moscow, Russia. And so we've done some good work here. And I'm grateful. I am so thankful to God. Every day I get up with a sermon on my mind that I can start talking to people who don't know the gospel. And what a privilege it is to be that person that God has given me this opportunity. I am humbled by it greatly. If you have that book flipped open, we've got about 6 minutes, if I can see well back there. You remember that in Romans 16 is salute one another with a holy kiss. The churches of Christ salute you. I have a sermon where I show what the churches of Christ are all about from this chapter. For instance, in this chapter you will find that there are 3 house churches that can be identified in Rome. 3 house churches. So, what is the Church of Christ? The churches of Christ are assemblies of people in different locations, assemblies of believers in different locations, assemblies of baptized believers in different locations. But notice that all these 3 congregations were house churches somewhere. For instance, Aquila and Priscilla had a church in their house, and then you can identify 2 more in this chapter. And so these are 3 churches of Christ, but watch this. Here's something else about the Church of Christ. They all got the same letter. What does that suggest to you? They should all be knowing this and teaching this. You don't have one letter to Romans for Aquila and Priscilla's church and then those other 2 separate, you see. But what the 3 got came from one letter. And so it is with all of them. If the Apostle Paul is writing to the Galatians, every other church of Christ ought to pay attention to Galatians. And so this is the way it is. This is our authority. And even in our world today, that's the way it ought to be. Churches of Christ, wherever you find them, ought to have some characteristics. One characteristic is right in verses 1 and 2. What's that? I commend unto you Phoebe, our sister, which is a servant of the church which is at Cenchrea, that you receive her in the Lord as becomes saints, that you assist her in whatever business she has need of you. For she has been a succorer of many, and myself also. So here is a patron of the church, a helper in the church, and he sends a letter, probably this letter, by her, and says, I commend to you this sister in Christ. What does this suggest? These churches are cooperating. They're all separate, but they're cooperating. They'll put you up. They'll see that you have everything that you need. If you're sick, they'll take care of you. If you need assistance, they'll help you out, no matter where you go in the world. Excuse me. You ever been in a situation where all of a sudden you meet a brother or sister in Christ? What happens? You didn't know they were brothers and sisters in Christ, but then at that moment you knew that they were brothers and sisters in Christ. What happened? Immediately there's instant camaraderie. I tell you, there's something wrong if there is instant suspicion. There's something wrong if there is immediate suspicion. We should have immediate camaraderie, assisting one another in whatever it is you need assistance. This is the church of Jesus Christ. My time is up. A couple of more points I would like to say, but you'll just have to dig it out yourself. But good to see all of you this morning. Thank you for your kind attention. You listen so well, and I appreciate it. Look forward to the worship to come.